Hello everyone, my name is Katie and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video we are ranking decades of rock and metal music. So we're going to be starting in the 1950s and we're going to go up to the 2020s, which is pretty crazy to think about how many decades there has been of rock and metal music and how it's evolved. It's going to be really fun to just look over all of it. I'm going to be doing my tier list a little bit different than usual. The rankings are going to have like different names than usual. You'll see, but I'm really excited to dig into this. I know a lot of rock and metal history, but I never really sit down and think about which decades I like the most, so let's jump into it. First off, at the top of the tier list, we're going to have the best tier. So this is just going to be the decade that I think was the absolute best for all reasons, whether it be influence that it had on the genre as a whole or just like the style of music itself. It's going to be those ones that I feel like had the full package. The next tier is called Respect for Influence. This is going to be the decades that I think were very important for rock and metal history, but don't really hold up as like musically the best. The decades where they were breaking the ice a little bit, but I feel like they didn't peak musically yet. The next tier is Solid. This pretty much just means like it's not amazing, but it's good. You know, it's not bad by any means. Boring, self-explanatory, and then bad, self-explanatory. So, like I said, we are starting with the 1950s. So this is going to be like rock and roll all the way up to like the heaviest of metal. I'm going to try to include everything in my decisions that I make for each decade. So 1950s, we're going to talk about the people like Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Chuck Berry, that whole era of music. I feel like obviously that is really the most important decade of rock music because it was when the whole like ideology of rock and roll, like the embodiment of rock and roll, really became a thing. You got to think of these guys like Elvis and Jerry Lee and all of them. They brought on this like rebellion that you hadn't really seen before. Times were very different in the 50s. People were very uptight and square, as they would call it, and a lot of these rock and roll guys just threw away that whole thing. They started making songs about like having sex and just different things like that. You know, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing started to become a thing. A lot of people were like torn by it. Like the parents of that generation really hated rock and roll, but then the kids loved it and it became this big thing that just took the world by storm. So it's very important. I feel like they created sort of that like rock and roll style, like that lifestyle, you know. Musically, it's not really my favorite. It obviously doesn't hit hard now. Being born in the 90s, I'm not really interested in listening to 50s music as much. But for what it is, I'm going to say Respect for Influence, because you have to bow down to the rock and roll gods. They basically took blues and turned it into something harder and something that really just took people's breath away back then. I actually just switched around the tiers. I feel like Solid should go under best and then the next one should be Respect for Influence. Anyways, now we have the 1960s. So I'm going to be talking mostly about like the later 60s bands, you know, like Blue Oyster Cult, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, all of that wave where they started to take this rock and roll sound and transform it into metal. They kind of coined the term heavy metal, you know, Black Sabbath specifically, but a lot of these bands were starting to make things a little bit heavier and harder, more distortion on their guitars, you know. Black Sabbath brought in this doomy sound, which it just really changed music. I feel like it was a very important part in rock and metal history. I think you might want to say it's as important as the 1950s. But for me personally, I like the music style more from this era. So I'm going to put it in... Oh, my bad. I meant to put the 1950s here. Okay. Sorry. Does this make sense now? I had it kind of messed up. The 1960s would go in Solid. I do like them more than the 1950s. Like I said, just because of the music style. I feel like bands like Deep Purple are really influential and sort of like inspired the metal bands later on. And same thing with Led Zeppelin. Like that rock and roll embodiment I was talking about, they really took that up to a 10. Like Robert Plant on stage with his horniness. I don't know, I just feel like that whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll stuff was like, you thought it was crazy in the 50s. Wait till you get to the 60s and the 70s as well. We are going to talk about the 70s too. A lot of these bands started in the late 60s and then went into the 70s, so these two are going to be kind of tied together. Let's not forget about bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd, Fleetwood Mac, and The Who, and the Grateful Dead, the Beatles even. All of these things were extremely important in music history, and I feel like most of these bands kind of are a part of the 70s decade now that I'm thinking about it. In the later 70s, we sort of introduced bands like Kiss and, oh yeah, Van Halen is a big one. A lot of these like more like hair bands sort of came onto the scene starting in the 70s. But I feel like a lot of the bands that started in the 60s were really big in the 70s. Like Queen is a good example of that. So I think I'm gonna put the 1970s with the 1960s in solid. I'm thinking about putting the 70s in the best tier because I feel like the 70s was just iconic. So many familiar and catchy and memorable songs come from the 70s. And all the bands that started in the 60s really like peaked in the 70s. And this was just when metal was really born. A lot of the sort of like glam bands started towards the end of this decade. Man, the 70s were on fire. We had so many different types of rock at this point. Everything was evolving. We had AC/DC, which were just like, that knocked people's socks off back then. Malcolm Young with his classic riffs and Angus Young with his stage presence and all these songs about this raunchy, dirty stuff, like I said. I just feel like that's really important. So I'm going to put the 70s in best. I see it kind of like the 60s, but it's better. It's when everything just like peaked for me. Not sure how I forgot to mention Pink Floyd and all of that, but fuck yeah, I love Pink Floyd. And then we have the 80s. Dude, the 80s are so much fun. This is really the era that got me as a kid. I was listening to a lot of the more like glam rock bands like Ozzy Osbourne on his own outside of Black Sabbath. We had bands like Van Halen, Def Leppard, all of that stuff, Skid Row. Oh my gosh, Bon Jovi, I could go on forever. All of those bands were just a really fun time. And the 80s was just all about having fun, I feel like. I don't know what it is or what was in the air in that time, but people were just wanting to have a good time. And I feel like it changed rock and roll a little bit. Before this, it was a little bit more serious and progressive. I feel like the 60s and the 70s were kind of psychedelic and everything took you on like this long journey. And in the 80s, bands started to just write songs that were more fun, I guess. Like dancing songs. It was kind of honestly just pop music at that point. A lot of people didn't like the hair bands. We are going to talk about like the thrash metal scene too. But a lot of people really didn't like the hair bands because they thought it was just too poppy and it wasn't rock and roll enough. But I think it still embodied rock and roll because it was all about having fun and rebelling and don't need nothing but a good time. You know what I mean? And, okay, in the 80s, we had a lot of these thrash bands. We had Metallica coming on the scene, a lot of the Bay Area bands, like Slayer, Anthrax, all of that. That was huge back then. And I feel like that changed music hardcore. Like, those bands that came out around that time, they were inspired by a lot of the older bands, like Motorhead and AC/DC and all of that. I feel like the bands that came out in the 80s changed everything. A lot of the people now in this current era copy the bands, not copy, but they're influenced by the bands from the 80s, specifically the metal bands. I feel like this is when metal really got heavy. Like, you could call the stuff before this heavy. You could call the bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and all of that heavy, and that did sort of trail into the 80s, but I feel like that Bay Area thrash metal stuff was one of the most important and most influential moments in rock and metal history. I pretty much think of the 80s as two things. I think of it as one, the side where it's hair bands with girls and cocaine and bright colors and all of that, and then I think of the super heavy metal guys, and they kind of were at a war with each other. I remember like Guns N' Roses and Metallica had this beef with each other because Guns N' Roses teetered the line of hair band and not hair band and like it's just funny looking back at all the controversy between rock music fans and all of that. It's so funny. But I'm going to say the 80s are the best, and I'm going to put it in front of the 1970s. We couldn't have the 80s music without the 70s music, alright? Like the 70s bands were extremely influential. Like I said, we had the Motorheads, the Judas Priest, all of that. That stuff was really important. However, the 80s just took all of that and made it into something I personally like more. I like the heaviness. Oh man, they really fucked it up, dude. I'm an 80s girl through and through. I think if there was any era I could live in just because of the music, it would be the 80s. Next up, we have the 1990s. So, honestly, I feel like the 90s was weird because we had a lot of the alternative rock bands coming on the scene, like the grunge ones like Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, all of that stuff. But then we had this weird metal stuff too, like Megadeth really became a thing in the 90s. I know they started in the 80s, but I feel like the 90s was really Megadeth's time, I guess. That's when they released like Countdown to Extinction and got more mainstream success. We had Metallica's Black Album in the 90s. This was when I feel like metal and rock were both getting more mainstream. Like the average everyday person listened to it more often, it seems like. Kind of happened in the 80s too, I guess. But I feel like the 90s was more of just like a radio rock era. It was just a common household thing to listen to these bands. We can't forget Pantera in the 90s. I feel like they were probably the heaviest mainstream band in the 90s. Like everyone was talking about them around that time. A lot of people didn't like them for different reasons because they were crazy or whatever. A lot of drama I've noticed watching back at documentaries. I noticed a lot of stuff went down with Pantera, and I don't even know. It's very interesting to watch. But I feel like metal was less at the forefront in the 90s. It was more about that grunge stuff. We had bands like Alice in Chains who kind of teeter the lines of grunge and metal. Like they had the sludgy thing going on. The 90s for me I'm gonna say are solid. It was a very big time. I feel like a lot of people that grew up in the 90s are big rock and metal fans still to this day. I think it left an imprint on a lot of people, and definitely one of the most influential times ever. This is sort of like that MTV era where the music videos were on all the time, and we had like Beavis and Butthead and all of that stuff, and like I said, it was just a little bit more mainstream. The 90s really sparked something that lasted to the 2000s. So now we're going to talk about the 2000s, and a lot of these alternative rock bands sort of came over into the 2000s, and also we started to see the emergence of nu metal. Bands like System of a Down and Korn and Slipknot. A lot of these bands that incorporated metal sounds with hip hop and different things like that. It was a very weird twist on anything we had heard before, and it really took the world by storm. I grew up in the 2000s. I was born in 97, so right at that time where I was reaching like consciousness and could really understand music and stuff was when the System of a Down bands were like really big, and I remember it being a really popular thing, you know, same thing with the MTV stuff. It was still very mainstream and accessible. I think that's the reason why I really got into rock and metal, is because it was always on the TV and stuff like that. And I had an older sister who was a teen at the time, and her like following all these trendy things trickled down onto me. So it's just interesting to see how trendy nu metal was. And even some of the punk bands, like we had like My Chemical Romance and Green Day, that like punk and pop punk era, all that stuff was really popular then. I see the 90s and the 2000s sort of like cousins, I guess. I guess the late 90s and the early 2000s are very similar. We had the bands like Creed around those decades and Stained and all of that. For me, musically, I don't really listen to a lot of the 2000s bands anymore. I would say the 2000s is in the best tier just because of the influence it had on me as a kid. The music I heard in the 2000s is what made me explore older music. Like, I started getting into older and older metal from like the 80s after I got introduced to it by the nu metal stuff. But musically, now as an adult, I don't really see it as best. I'd say it's solid. I'm gonna put it in front of the 90s. I don't know, they're kind of tied for me, but musically solid. When it comes to like influence personally, it would be best, but I will try to take my personal bias out of this just a little bit, because I know sometimes I can put too much of that into these lists. Next up, we have the 2010s. So, okay, I feel like we lost ourselves in the 2010s. This is when I was a teenager, and looking back at my mixtapes that I made, like the CDs that I burnt or whatever back then, the music was horrible. I don't know what was going on. I listened to a lot of radio rock at the time, and it was a lot of the stuff like Shinedown, Blackstone Cherry, like those kind of bands. I don't know, sort of like dad rock-ish, people call it. Chad rock, I don't know. That stuff was really bad. And then on the metal side of things, it was a lot of metalcore bands, but they were starting to incorporate weird stuff, like not so much like nu metal with the hip hop. It was more of like they would introduce like EDM, like electronic sounds in with the metalcore. And it was a thing that was cool at first, but like every band did it. You know, you had the bands like Asking Alexandria, Motionless in White, Falling in Reverse, all of those sorts of things. They all started to like blend in and be the same to me. You know, all the little skinny guys with the skinny jeans and the white t-shirts. It got old after a while. Like, looking back, I feel like we can kind of make fun of it because it's kind of a silly era. But I don't know, like, it didn't age well for me. Looking back, I don't see it as a very important part of rock and metal history. It's crazy that I say that because I was super in it at that time. That is when I was like fully immersed into this stuff. Like, as a teen, I finally had that like creative freedom and really got into this stuff. And I'd say around 2012, 2013, I was super into it. As I turned like 16, 17 years old is when I started listening to the older stuff again, like from the 80s. I always go back to the 80s. I don't know what it is. But I don't know, it just doesn't feel that important to me. I'm gonna say bad. I'm sorry. I just think the 2010s were very forgettable. If I wasn't in my adolescence during that time, I don't think I would ever think about this era of music. And last but not least, we have the 2020s. So this is right now. I mean, we're only 3 years into this one, but I feel like it's worth talking about because I've had this weird breakthrough with music recently. I don't know if I've ever explained this on this YouTube channel before, but I would say from around like 2016 to 2020, I was not interested in any new music. I was pretty much only listening to things I knew already. I kind of like didn't have a passion for rock or metal music anymore. It was just like dead. I don't know what it was. Nothing that I heard that came out sparked an interest in me. So eventually I just slowly like kind of gave up on new music and was like not really actively searching for things anymore. At some point I just gave up. But I feel like around 2020, maybe around 2021, a lot of older bands that I listened to started to release some new music, and it kind of like re-sparked my interest a little bit. And I don't know what happened. I feel like bands started getting more creative. A lot of the bands that are more popular right now in the scene aren't really respected because people say that they're not heavy enough or this or that. But some of the more like progressive, maybe industrial bands that I think are really making moves are bands like Bad Omens and Sleep Token. I feel like those bands sort of started this new resurgence in metal and rock, alternative rock, whatever you want to call it. I think they're kind of bringing it back from the dead after all these years. I think Ghost is really making moves in the 2020s. We have Metallica coming out with some new stuff, which, I mean, let's be honest, it's probably not going to be that special. But I have noticed a lot of these bands are like sort of coming back from the dead. And a lot of newer bands are coming up on a rise. Or bands that have been out for a while but never really got a lot of attention are starting to get more attention. Bands like Lorna Shore, everyone is obsessed with Will Ramos from Lorna Shore and his insane vocals. And I've noticed people are becoming more like intrigued by this style of music again. We have some rock bands like Greta Van Fleet who are sort of reviving that 70s rock sound. And it's just really cool to see that style of music being brought back. We also have bands like Crownlands and Dirty Honey and all of those sort of bands. There's sort of this new trend that Greta Van Fleet kind of started of bringing back this old 60s and 70s rock sound. I just feel like right now, maybe post-COVID, we got into this new creative era where people were either like rehashing old things and making it their own, you know, sort of like the rock bands I was talking about, and then the metal bands are just doing completely new things. Like if you listen to a band like Sleep Token, they are so complex in their song compositions and just their style in general. They mix so many genres and do a bunch of genre bending, and it's very interesting to listen to, and it's different. It takes things from all over the place and puts it into one song. So I think we're at the point right now where a lot has been done in rock and metal, and we either have to be innovative or go back to the old stuff or something like that. While I will say that a lot of bands are coming out with cool stuff right now, I find it a little bit boring, just a little bit, but I don't think looking back in the 2030s we're going to feel that way. I think we're at the start of something really cool. Ever since post-COVID, you know, a lot of people were kind of sitting around during COVID, and it gave a lot of time for creative juices to flow. And I think things from that are just now starting to come out. We're seeing the same thing happen in movies and other forms of media too. So I think we are in an awakening of rock and metal. And I added another tier just for this because I don't want to put it in boring. While some things are a little bit boring right now, I think we're headed towards something good. So I'm going to say it has potential. I know this makes no sense for a ranking list to put this here, but I'm not going to put anything in boring. I just think I respect and love the genre too much to really feel that way fully about any decade of this genre. But 2020s has potential to be a pretty good decade of music. I hope it at least goes into the solid tier later on in the 2030s. I guess I'll see you guys in, what, 7 years? And we'll see. At the end of the day, every single style of music influences each other, and every decade of music influences the other, and it's all important in this thing we call life and just the history of music as a whole. So it's all important at the end of the day, and I really like breaking it down and talking about it like this. But I guess that's all for my tier list. Let me know in the comments below what you would change, if we have completely different tastes or if they're pretty spot on or close to each other. Let me know. But I guess that's all I have for today's video, so thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Hit the dislike if you didn't. That's totally fine. Make sure you subscribe for future rock and metal related content. That's so hard for me to remember to say. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye!